The employment of the person was clearly determined by a person's obligations. This is typically the case wherever in a barter economy the performance of a service commits someone to perform one in return. Service and personality, however, soon diverged to such an extent that the person under obligation would, in principle, be entitled to withdraw his personality completely from the service and perform it in a purely objective manner by producing it, for instance, through the labor of another person. But in reality this is virtually ruled out by the economic system and by means of the product which must be given in payment. In this product the human subject himself remains under obligation and his personal energy is still confined in a certain direction. To what extent the principle of objectivity nonetheless represents a development towards freedom when compared with the principle of personality is shown, for example, by the greatly increased capacity of estate officials to hold a fief during the 13th century. For, as a result, their previous personal dependency was transformed into a merely objectified, dinglish, one and thereby placed under common law, that is, they were given freedom in all matters except those connected with feudal service. One finds a similar phenomenon today. When talented people, who are forced to work for a wage, prefer to work for a company with its strictly objective organization rather than for an individual employer, or when a shortage of domestic servants occurs because girls prefer factory work to service with people of authority, where they are certainly in a better position materially but feel themselves less free in their subordination to individual personalities. Money payment as the form most congruent with personal freedom, the third level, where the person is actually excluded from the product and the demands no longer extend to him, is reached with the replacement of payment in kind by money payment. For this reason, it has been regarded, to some extent, as a Magna Carta of personal freedom in the domain of civil law. Classical Roman law declared that, if a payment in kind were refused, then any demand for payment could be met with money. This is, therefore, the right to buy oneself out of a personal obligation by means of money. The lord of the manor who can demand a quantity of beer or poultry or honey from a serf thereby determines the activity of the latter in a certain direction. But the moment he imposes merely a money levy the peasant is free, in so far as he can decide whether to keep bees or cattle or anything else. Formally, in the sphere of personal labor services, the same process takes place with the right of appointing another person as a substitute, and the other party has to accept the latter unless his competence is in doubt. This right, which sets the whole conception of the relationship on a new basis, must often be fought for since it is felt that, like the right to make payment in money, it is a step on the way towards a dissolution of the entire obligation. The authors of the Doomsday Survey characteristically selected terms for the peasants who replaced their sockages by regular money payments which were intended to show that they were neither totally free nor totally subordinate. For a long time, however, the names of the money levies continued to reveal their origin in payments in kind, kitchen tax, barrel money, lodging money, instead of the provision of accommodation for the lords of the manor and their officials as they traveled around, honey tax, etc., were all levied. It is often the case, in a transitional phase, that the original payment in kind was estimated in money and that this sum was demanded as a substitute. This transitional phenomenon also occurs in relationships that are far removed from the example dealt with here. In 1877 in Japan all levies and taxes were still either paid in rice or calculated in rice and paid in money. Similarly, under Elizabeth I, the rent for certain estates belonging to the universities was fixed in terms of corn although payment was apparently made in silver. At least the identity of the value of the obligation is still emphasized in this manner, but any personal bondage resulting from rigidly fixed contents has already been thrown off. If the ius primi noctis had really existed anywhere, then its development would have followed analogous steps. Every one of the feudal lord's rights extended to the whole of the obligated person who had to forfeit his most fundamental possessions or rather his being. This would have been the price at which the lord would have granted his female subjects the right to marry. The next stage is that he grants this right, which he can deny at any time in exchange for a sum of money. The third stage is that the lord's veto as such is abolished and the subject is now free to marry if he or she pays the lord of the manor a fixed sum, bride wealth, marriage money, bridal money, etc. Personal liberation is certainly linked with money, though not exclusively at the second stage, since the approval of the lord of the manor still had to be won and could not be attained by force. The relationship is completely depersonalized only when no factors other than money payment are involved in the decision. Before the abolition of every right of this nature that the lord of the manor possesses, personal freedom cannot rise any higher than when the obligation of the subject is transformed into a money payment which the lord of the manor has to accept. Consequently, the reduction and eventually the complete replacement of peasants' services and payments frequently took place through their transformation into sums of money. This connection between a payment of money and liberation can perhaps be regarded by the person entitled to some service as being so effective that he himself suppresses the liveliest interest in cash payments. The transformation of peasant sockages and payments in kind into money levies took place in Germany from the 12th century onwards, and the process was interrupted simply because in the 14th and 15th centuries the feudal lords also fell prey to capitalism. For they realized that payments in kind were far more elastic and susceptible to arbitrary extension than were money payments, which, once they had been quantitatively and numerically fixed, could not be altered. This advantage of payments in kind seemed, in their eyes, great enough to make them seize it in their greed at the moment when otherwise money interests were predominant. It is precisely for this reason that people were completely unwilling to allow the peasant to become rich. The English copyholder was not generally allowed to sell any cattle without the special permission of his lord. For by selling cattle he obtained money with which he could acquire land elsewhere and extricate himself from his obligations to his previous lord. The greatest step forward in the process of liberation is achieved through a development within money payment itself when a single capital payment replaces the periodical levy. Even if the objective value is identical in both forms of payment, the effect upon the human subject is quite different. As we have pointed out, the various payments levied certainly give the obligated person complete freedom in terms of his actions, provided that he obtains the money required. But the regularity of the payments forces such action into a fixed scheme, imposed by an alien power, and so it is only with the capitalization of the payments that the form of all kinds of obligations is attained which corresponds to the greatest personal freedom. Thus, it is only with the capital payment that the obligation is entirely converted into a money payment, whereas the money levy with its regular recurrence still preserves at least a formal element of bondage over and above the value required in payments. This distinction is manifested in the following manner. In the 13th century and later the English Parliament often decided that the counties had to provide a certain number of soldiers or workers for the king. The representatives of the counties, however, regularly replaced the provision of men with a money payment. But no matter how much personal freedom was saved in this manner, there is a fundamental distinction between this and the rights and freedoms that the English people purchased from their monarchs through single votes on money. If the person receiving the capital is then freed from all the insecurities to which he is subjected in the case of individual levies, then the corresponding equivalent on the side of the obligated person is that his freedom is converted from the unstable form that it possesses when recurrent payments have to be made into a stable form. The freedom of the English people with regard to their monarchs depends partially upon the fact that, by means of capital payments, the people had settled matters with their king once and for all with respect to certain rights. A document from Henry III states, for example, pro hac concession dederent nobis quintem decimam partem omnium mobilium suorum. It is not in spite of but precisely because of the fact that such an agreement concerning the freedoms of the people reveals a somewhat brutal, external and mechanical character that it implies the most complete antagonism contrary to the feelings of the king that no piece of paper should come between him and his people. Yet precisely for this reason it also constitutes a radical abolition of all the imponderables of more emotional relations which, when freedoms are attained in a form less tied to money transactions, often provide the means for revoking them or making them illusory.